Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie. I'm a senior fellow here at Bruegel, and I am joined today with Ben McWilliams, an affiliate fellow at Bruegel and one of our in-house energy experts, and Johanna Schiele from the European Commission. We are going to talk to you about hydrogen and its potential to be a source of renewable energy if conditions are right. And we're also going to talk about the levels of subsidies that might be needed to make it happen. Ben, why do people keep talking about hydrogen as part of the green transformation?
Thanks, Rebecca, for having me on the podcast again. And thanks, Johanna, for joining us, who's much more of an expert on this than me. But I'll do my best to give a brief introduction to hydrogen. So hydrogen is a molecule which we can use for doing different things. You can use in industrial applications, for example, producing chemicals like ammonia. And it also has other potential uses in energy. We already use it today for lots of these industrial things, ammonia production, the refining of oil. People get quite excited about hydrogen when they think about the extra things it might do in a decarbonized economy. This really ranges, and there's a lot of controversy in the space. You have some people who I think are becoming quieter and quieter who argue hydrogen can do lots of things. It could drive our cars, it could warm our homes. This is kind of the far reaches of what hydrogen could do, and most people are quite skeptical and see a much more narrow use for hydrogen. But that typically involves doing things which electricity can't do. So things, for its chemical properties, making chemicals, producing ammonia, but also some things that we'll need in the future, such as flying airplanes. Electric vehicles look pretty competitive, and there's quite a strong business case that we'll be able to drive cars with electricity, but it's unlikely, or at the moment looks less likely, we'll be able to use batteries for aviation. And there's kind of innovation in that space and arguments that we might one day use synthetic fuels produced by hydrogen from that. And one more big caveat to all of this is that almost all of the hydrogen that we use in Europe, and in fact in the world at the moment, is actually very dirty in terms of the carbon emissions. In Europe, we typically separate it from a stream of natural gas, and that leaves off carbon dioxide to go into the environment. So clearly a prerequisite for people being excited about this in the transition is producing it in a new way. It's called electrolysis. So you essentially split water into its hydrogen and its oxygen atoms with an electrical current. And so that's kind of the combination. That costs have been coming down for this. Maybe this year that they've stalled a bit, but they have been coming down for that technique as the costs of renewable electricity fall, which is the main input. And at the same time as the production comes down, there's lots of ideas of how you might use this throughout the economy, which we might get more into. But that's my best effort at a 3-minute overview.
It's super helpful. So hydrogen is a fuel that we can make from other stuff that is already produced in the air, but we do have to use electricity to either pull it off natural gas or pull it out of water. And then once we have it, we can use it either as a fuel on its own, perhaps to fly an airplane, or we can use it to make chemicals out of, like you can put it back together and turn it into ammonia. Is that more or less right?
Almost. Just the route using so that the natural gas route is just using the natural gas itself as an energy source and splitting it off, so there's no electricity involved. The electricity comes from the clean route, or one of the clean routes, which is the electrolysis, and the idea of pumping renewable electricity into water, splitting it, and being able to do this perhaps with, you can imagine midday sun in Spain and having huge excess demand, being able to turn all that into hydrogen and then do useful things with it. That's kind of where the excitement comes from.
And is hydrogen a fuel that you can transport the way that people can move oil around, or do you have to turn it into something else and then re-split it when it gets there?
So there's different things you can do. Typically, people would consider if you have a pipeline, it will be more efficient at transportation than electricity in terms of the energy retained, but far less so than oil. So it's not something like oil, which is really perfect for traveling around. Hydrogen itself is quite volatile, and in gaseous state, you'd have to keep it at a very high pressure It's kind of an industrial space. There's things like liquefying hydrogen. You can use other kind of organic carriers. You can already transform it into ammonia and then transport it as that, which is what's needed. One school of thought is, in fact, that because of the difficulties in transporting hydrogen by itself, we might actually see it increasingly turned into final products, which might be ammonia, but might also be things like steel, and then transported in that format rather than hydrogen, because it is a bit difficult to transport, especially on a ship.
That's super interesting. And I want to come back to this topic of steel production because steel is so energy intensive. So, okay, we have hydrogen and we need it, and we can make it a bunch of different ways that some of our listeners might have heard about, referred to by colors, like gray, which is the old-fashioned natural gas model, or green, which is from water and no carbon emissions, or other colors depending on if you use nuclear power or carbon capture or other things. We are not going to talk about the color scheme. Haha. I'm in charge. I can make us not talk about it. But we are going to talk about emissions-free hydrogen and specifically what types of government support we need to make it happen. And this is why we have Johanna on the air. Now, just for listeners who are new to this topic, the basic idea is it costs a lot more to make the emissions-free hydrogen than it does to make the old dirty-style hydrogen. So you can maybe convince people to pay extra for it if they want to meet their own emissions reductions targets or otherwise save the planet, but it's a lot more. So we've been looking at ways, the European Union has been looking at ways to subsidize that extra cost, where maybe the customer pays a little bit more, and then the gap between how much they're willing to pay and how much it actually costs to make this thing is filled by a government subsidy. But where to set the level of the subsidy? This is really hard. So, as I understand it, the EU has come up with an auction system for selling the subsidy that determines the level of the subsidy and then how many subsidies you can hand out with the amount of money available. And it has gotten started already. So, Johanna, tell us how this came to be and how it went and what's going on.
Hi, Rebecca. Hi, Ben. It's really nice to be with you and be on the podcast. Indeed, we have a new auction. We have the first ever EU-wide renewable hydrogen auction, which we launched at the end of this year. And we've been able to announce results from that auction already this April. So now where we're at is that we have a lot of data that we can talk about. But I think it's good if we split the discussion maybe in two parts. One is sort of the more economicsy rationale for why would we use an auction for that? And the other one is what actually happened, what are the results, is this promising, and will we do it again?
And before we do either of those, just tell us how this came to be. What happened last year? How were you ready to go this year? Like, how did we even get as far as we are?
So auctions in the energy space are not actually something new. We use auctions, especially in the power sector, already to allocate subsidies. So you might have heard, if you're German, you might have heard about the EEG scheme, the renewable energy scheme. If you live in the UK, there's a CFD scheme. Same in Poland and France. It's not a new thing. We use auctions to subsidize renewable power. Now, increasingly in the power sector, thankfully, renewables have become as cheap or even cheaper than fossil sources of power. So we don't really need these heavy subsidies there anymore. But even in the renewable space, if we go maybe 20 years back, at the beginning, many member states subsidized renewable power through things like a feed-in tariff, where every kilowatt hour of power produced got reimbursed the whole cost that it took to produce that kilowatt hour of power. Or they got subsidized through capex schemes, where the state would pay the capital cost of putting up a windmill or a solar panel. And these types of subsidies are good in a nascent market where you really don't know quite yet, is the thing working, is it not working? There's no clear business case at all. But it's quite a lot of taxpayers' money that can go out of the window without being able to achieve the maximum output that you want to achieve with it. And then in the power sector, in the 2010s, depending on the country, I think the UK was amongst the first, legislators have moved to a more competitive or closer to market mechanism instrument to allocate that subsidy. And that is an auction. Essentially what happens in an auction for subsidy is that you auction off a subsidy in euros per unit of output produced. And the person who can produce that product at the cheapest subsidy cost, so with the least taxpayer money, or in our case, it's actually ETS funds from the European Emissions Trading System, they win the subsidy. Why is this a good idea? It's a good idea because it replicates market dynamics. It really means that projects have an incentive to reveal their real cost and to reveal how much subsidy they really need, as opposed to relying on a lot of people in the public administration to trying to understand the financial models or the cost structures that private companies submit to them. You rely on an incentive in the auction to bid as cheap as you can to win, but as high as you must to still make your project financially viable.
Cool. So over the past year, you've been putting together a system like this for clean hydrogen, and now you've actually done it. How did it go?
So for hydrogen, we took inspiration from these auctions in the power sector. And actually, the idea from the European legislator, from the Commission, is already in the ETS directive since the last ETS directive revision. So we wrote the option of doing competitive bidding into the ETS directive, and this is our legal base for doing this. And initially, when we did that, what we had in mind was to do carbon contracts for difference, which is a much broader and more technology neutral scheme for auctioning off carbon abatement, so much beyond hydrogen. But then the energy price crisis happened, the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, energy prices went through the roof, and the Commission passed the REPowerEU package, which put a strong focus on hydrogen. So that in the end, for our subsidy program, which is called the Innovation Fund, that made a difference to starting this auctioning system with hydrogen and maybe moving to other products in the future. And then things went fairly quickly. We started to consult on auction design roughly a year ago. We got together with a lot of stakeholders, really asked them, can this work for you? Does this work for the banks? Does this work for the project developers? We came out with a draft auction design, which we consulted again. And then we had some final terms and conditions, which outline the final auction design. Project developers knew about this a couple of months before they had to submit their bids, so they had some time to get used to this idea of an auction and how it works. And then we went from project developers submitting their bids to us announcing the results in less than half a year.
That's amazing. What did we learn?
We learned a lot. I think the first learning is that it worked. That wasn't clear. This was a pilot project, so there was also an option that this is maybe not the right instrument for the nascent hydrogen market. As Ben already said earlier, hydrogen is hard to transport, and there's not that much transport infrastructure around. And that means that hydrogen is not a traded commodity like gas or oil is. And there's also no uniform price, because the price for hydrogen in one location is very different from the price at another location, because there is not that much transport infrastructure. So it's quite hard to try to use a market-based instrument for a product where there is no liquid market and there is no liquid market price. There's just lots of individual over-the-counter trades between different parties. So the first learning is this market is ready for an auction-style instrument. And we received in total 132 bids, which is a lot, and it's really good because it creates competition, and it means that the prices that resulted from this auction, they're really reliable price points, and they're price points that are based on a good level of competition. What else did we learn? We learned a lot about where hydrogen production is cheap, but also in which sectors off-takers or consumers of that hydrogen are willing to pay more or less for that hydrogen. We learn a lot about where potential consumers and producers are, and that can give us insights into where we need to build infrastructure. And we learn a lot about costs. How much do these projects cost, and how much subsidy might we need in the future?
Thanks so much. When we come back, we'll talk more about these geographic differences, because I think that's important for understanding the market. Welcome back to our hydrogen podcast. Ben, you wrote an excellent analysis for the Bruegel.org website where, among other things, you said that the auction was most successful either in the Iberian Peninsula or in the Nordics, which are places that are notably advanced in renewable energy. So I guess that's good in that things are branching out, but also is there a substitution effect? Are we just seeing the places where dirty electricity gets dirtier and the people who are clean get cleaner? How do we think through that?
Maybe one just extra framing on also Johanna's very helpful comments on the one positive I think that we've learned is that it seems the European Commission is able to stimulate hydrogen projects by paying only a very small share of the price gap. I think very high level numbers, the subsidy was around 40 cents per kilogram, and kind of industry estimates would think more like €4 per kilogram is the price gap between producing clean and dirty hydrogen. So, I don't know what Johanna thinks, but I think in general, people were quite positively surprised that the price was so low and that they weren't endowed with a lot of money compared to the target. So it's nice that money looks like it will be able to go a little bit further. Sorry for the aside.
No, it's not an aside. We need to know that. Thank you for walking us through it.
Sure. And yeah, on the geography, that's one point that we raised. Using, again, the Commission data, they made a lot available from these bids, which was really interesting. And we kind of put the bids on a map. And it strikes out that the cheapest bids, they come from the Nordics, they come from Spain and Portugal, and they come from Greece. These countries all have in common that they have pretty attractive renewable endowments, either hydropower or solar power. And I think that there's a hypothesis in literature, which I think we're starting to see being played out in reality, which is called the renewables pull. And it's the idea that in the same way that oil and gas a little bit pulled manufacturing investments in the past, or at least access to a port or access to a pipeline which carries oil and gas to your factory, as we transition away from oil and gas toward electricity, and typically toward renewable electricity with still some role for nuclear probably, there's this hypothesis that renewables themselves, so just where it's sunny and where it's windy, will pull investments. And if it's true, it has a very significant impact kind of on the industrial structure of Europe and the world. And I think we saw that in the hydrogen bank. We saw winning bids in Spain, Portugal, I think it was Finland from the north. And one take is that will potentially eventually create difficulties or some trade-offs when thinking about doing industrial policy at European level. If we're thinking of this in a European perspective, it's amazing. It's great. We get the cheapest hydrogen produced in the most efficient places and the funds flow there. Of course, I can think of one country, particularly in Northwest Europe, Germany, who won't be particularly pleased if lots of hydrogen production shifts away from there, where lots of the industry is now acting. So that's a trade-off to balance this economic efficiency versus kind of cooperating with member states and ensuring that countries still retain industrial competencies that they might want to do for political or social pressures.
Johanna?
Yeah, maybe I'm just going to react to that. So I think that's a really interesting analysis, and obviously it's something that people also talk about a lot. I first want to say something about what goes into these bids, because it's actually not just the OPEX cost. So the way that a rational bidder would formulate their bid is that they would say, what are my total levelized cost of producing this hydrogen, so my discounted costs over the lifetime of the project, and what are the revenues that I can achieve in the market? And then they would bid the difference between the revenues that they can achieve and the costs that they have to close that gap. They, as I said before, they want to go as low as they can to maximize their chances of winning, but as high as they must to actually realize their project. And here we also really want to make sure that these projects are built. We care about this being built and not just the announcement at the end of the subsidy round. So we have introduced something that's called a completion bond, which is basically a penalty if you bid, but then you don't build. And for the next round, we're even proposing to increase that completion bond or that deposit a little bit more. Now, what goes into these costs for the hydrogen is to a large extent the operating cost or the cost for the renewable power. That's roughly 60 to 70% of the total project cost, depending on where you are. Then there's also CapEx, so projects that can source more cost competitive equipment, or that just have better project economics because they have better contract management or better OEM provider, or they're just better to project management. They also have an advantage. A third really important factor is the cost of capital, or the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital. So the lower the cost at which you can raise capital to finance these projects, the cheaper they will get. And that's something where traditionally, for example, a country like Germany would have big advantages because they have really low capital costs. And lastly, the revenue side is really important. The revenue side is determined by the willingness to pay of the off-takers of this hydrogen. And this is driven by regulation, by things like quotas of how much hydrogen needs to be used in industry or in transport, etc., but also just how much pressure there is to decarbonize, and that's driven by the CO2 price. So I think there's more factors than just the renewables cost that go into determining these bids. And I would wait a couple of rounds of the auction to see how this geographical balance plays out. But yes, of course, renewable costs are important. And now I'm coming a bit more to the political point here. We, as the European Commission, we obviously have an incentive to support European competitiveness, and we care that hydrogen produced in the EU is done at a cost-effective way, for example, in comparison to in the US or in other regions that are non-EU, because we have to be competitive with our industry as a bloc. We care about European competitiveness, and we can't really afford to get into races of one country within the EU against another country within the EU. But on the other hand, of course, we totally understand that there is a lot of political considerations behind existing industrial bases and where they are at the moment. And this is why we've come up with a concept called auctions as a service, where we allow individual member states to top up our European budget, which goes to the cheapest producers across Europe, with additional national budget, with the permission or the intention to subsidize more expensive projects in individual European countries if a member state wants to do so. So I think we're really trying to strike a good balance here between individual national concerns and a need to be competitive as a bloc, as Europe.
That's really interesting. Now, Ben, let's come back to these geographical differences. You said earlier that it's hard to move hydrogen around. So is it possible that there could be a demand in some of these, industrial centers that might cause them to want to produce their own hydrogen, even if they also have these other factors like existing industry or lack of cheap renewables or things like that push them in the other direction?
Yeah, I think there's perhaps two scenarios moving forwards. And as always, obviously, we'll end up with a hybrid of both. And the first would be for a pipeline system of hydrogen transportation around Europe. That's the cheapest way. It's expensive to transport it by ship. But if you build a pipeline and you have it going from A to B, then it becomes quite cheap to shift hydrogen around, comparable to natural gas. I think a bit more expensive, but same orders of magnitude. So that's one scenario where you could imagine we build big pipelines across Europe. In fact, don't even build, but even retrofit some of the existing gas network, which we don't need anymore. And then you imagine the hydrogen can be produced in places of low cost, but then transported to the Ruhr, for example. And then you could have, with, as Johanna mentioned, kind of these lower capital cost benefits. You have also agglomeration benefits of keeping industries in the same place. And that's one scenario. And if I was the German government, I would push aggressively for this. And I think they are trying to do so. But I must say the progress is very slow. I think it's about 4 years now since this whole hydrogen backbone is the word people have given to this concept, has been going. And there hasn't really been any much significant progress. Lots of conversations, but not really on the ground, serious progress. The alternative scenario is that we don't have significant pipeline transportation of hydrogen, in which case my hypothesis would be that much of what we want to do with hydrogen in terms of producing ammonia, in terms of producing steel, in terms of maybe producing things like synthetic kerosene for flying airplanes in a carbon neutral manner, if that's the way our aviation goes, will happen in places where hydrogen is cheap. And by extension, that will likely mean places where there's renewable abundance. It's not just about renewables, it's also about land availability. You need lots of land for doing these things. But the kind of correlation of drawing this to places on the map with strong hydro, with strong solar, I think is is a good one. And in that scenario, you might see shipping transportation of final products away from these areas to demand centers around Europe. And you might also see that outside of Europe. Certain things, it would likely make more sense just to do them in South America or in Australia and ship them in from there. So I think there's kind of economic forces on one hand, which will push in one direction. There's governments on the other who will have a pull away from them. And there's this question about what happens with the transportation system for hydrogen, what decisions are made and what does Europe build out. And I think all of those will add up, which I think is fascinating. I spend time thinking about it, maybe others do as well. But I think it's fascinating. Will be interesting to see play out in the next few years.
That's really interesting. Johanna, what would you like to add?
Yeah, maybe to add a little bit the DG Klima perspective to this as well, because we have similar discussions on carbon pricing, right? We have a carbon price in Europe, which means we're making some processes more expensive in Europe because we put a carbon price on them. And we have just now introduced the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is basically a protective measure to protect European competitiveness from carbon leakage or from the production of these products moving outside the EU. And hydrogen and ammonia are actually two of those products that are protected by that instrument. So yes, these considerations are very much at the forefront of our thinking when we make these types of policies.
When we come back, we'll talk more about the EU's role in the world. So where does the EU stand compared to other parts of the world? Is the EU a leader in hydrogen? Is it catching up to anybody? Are people working together? Are they working on separate tracks? How do things look?
I can give a few brief thoughts and Johanna can complement. I think the clean hydrogen space is one where there's still a lot of open opportunity for competition and for leaders to emerge. It's not quite like the solar panel space, for example, where China has a clear comparative advantage, and that's an industry that's been going for 20 years. The clean hydrogen is still nascent or emerging sector. Europe does have some companies who are in a nice position for manufacturing electrolyzers, which are the piece of equipment you use for turning water into hydrogen. And that's definitely something I think Europe should and is looking to double down upon. That's an area where Europe might develop a good technological advantage. And then more broadly in the clean hydrogen production, I think unavoidably it comes back to the costs of production, which is a little bit leaning back into the previous discussion where things like renewable availability, but also things like policy design will be really important. And that's somewhere where Europe is, and I can say Johanna might feel like she blows her own trumpet, but Europe has really led. I mean, we discussed this before we recorded the podcast, the meaning of additionality, which is this complex term for ensuring hydrogen doesn't cannibalize renewable electricity. And that's somewhere where the EU led in having a discussion and having a debate and designing the guidelines, and which now America, as it came forward with its huge package of subsidies, realized it also had to do. And then, as I understand, looked quite closely to the European system for understanding. So like in many spaces, Europe has this regulatory position. But also, I think it's definitely a space where Europe can be reasonably optimistic, at least if you compare it to some of these industries like the solar PV sector, where the position looks not quite as promising for European manufacturers, at least.
Could Europe end up in a situation which is more like for semiconductors, where a lot of the key manufacturing equipment is made here, even if it's used worldwide, as opposed to with solar panels, where Europe is a consumer and not a creator?
That would seem quite plausible to me, that Europe might retain a comparative advantage in manufacturing electrolyzers. But if we really start using hydrogen at scale in some of these things, for example, again, back to the aviation fuel, you also need something called a direct air capture plant. So you've got to take your CO2 out of the air, combine it with hydrogen to make a hydrocarbon. And that just means you need loads of land, loads of energy. And that's something that it looks to me like it will make more sense to do elsewhere. So I think there's definitely a push. It could be something similar to semiconductors.
maybe make a distinction here between hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives. So hydrogen is just H2, it's just H molecule, so there's no C atoms in there, and therefore when you combust it, there's also no CO2 emissions. But it's hard to transport, it's hard to burn, for example, in an internal combustion engine. So we produce lots of hydrogen derivatives, which are basically chemically equivalent to fossil fuels. So, for example, you can make synthetic kerosene or synthetic benzene for your car from hydrogen, and there you have to combine the H atom with C atoms again. And for that to be at least not carbon negative, but carbon neutral, you have to take that CO2, for example, out of the air, or if you take it from a biomass plant and then at some point you store it again, it might even be net negative. But it really depends where do these carbon atoms come from, if it's a clean fuel or not.
That's really interesting. And for our American listeners, benzene is what Europeans call regular unleaded gasoline.
Correct. Maybe one chance to come back again to this discussion on the origin of the electrolyzers, because that's a big political debate in Brussels at the moment. We've had the adoption of the Net Zero Industrial Act, which is aimed at promoting more resilient value chains, especially for clean tech, so for products like electrolyzers or solar panels, etc., that we need to make the energy transition work. And here, what we try to do with this hydrogen auction, which is not aimed at the electrolyzer manufacturer, it's aimed at the project developers who actually produce hydrogen. But we can still play a role in gathering information and publishing that information and really contributing to transparency in that market. So, for example, what we've done after this first pilot round is we published data on where the projects that have bid, whether they have won or not, it was 130 projects in total, where they intend to procure their electrolyzers from. And we made that data public. And I think this type of information gathering and increasing transparency around where the market is going, that's really important to then define other types of policies, like do you want to introduce resilience criteria in auctions or other measures that you might want to consider. But the beginning of all of these measures is having data, publishing it, and then having an informed discussion on the basis of that. So I think for the auction, I'm almost as excited about the data and the information that we could pull from it as I am about getting the money out of the door to project developers.
This is so interesting. How big is your project? Like how many auctions, how much money per auction, how much in total of subsidies do you currently have? Can it be renewed?
So that's a big question. So maybe first, where does the money come from? This hydrogen auction is run by the EU Innovation Fund, which is a large clean tech fund that's run by the European Commission and DG Klima, and it's funded by the European Emissions Trading System. So the money that we spend is not actually tax money, it's money that comes from the carbon price. Now, this auction is also run under an umbrella instrument, which is called the European Hydrogen Bank. And it's a very confusing term because it's not actually a bank. It's several instruments combined under a joint name because it sounds cool. And for this European Hydrogen Bank, a total budget of 3 billion euros was announced by President von der Leyen 2 years ago in her State of the Union speech. So I think that's the benchmark of the initial amount of money that we have available. Now, the Hydrogen Bank includes more than this domestic auction that we run with the Innovation Fund. There's also the idea to support imports from outside the EU into the EU, or to have other financial instruments like coordinating loans for these projects better, etc. Now, this makes things more complicated with the budget because the Innovation Fund gets money every week from selling allowances, and the carbon price fluctuates quite a lot. So we never know 100% in advance how much money we actually have every year. But what I can announce now already is that the first auction, which was a pilot, and we had a budget of 800 million euros, will lead to a second auction at the end of this year with a total budget of an expected 1.2 billion euros, so a budget increase. And the way that we see this instrument going and unfolding and the interest in it, we will definitely keep going with it, because that's also what you want to achieve with auctions, is you want to build a pipeline, create an expectation in the market that this is a recurring instrument, and you ultimately want to get the project costs down. So you want to follow this over some time and see other costs coming down. of course, you have to evaluate it at some point, not too late to be able to pull the plug if it's not happening. But it's an instrument that's here to stay.
So your $3 billion is over what time frame?
There is no fixed indication of the time frame.
And the two auctions, the pilot one and the one you've just described happening in the future, those come out to about $2 billion. So that leaves another $1 billion in the initial allocation, plus or minus, I know, depending on your ETS income. But we can expect another $1 billion coming after that, even before any renewal decisions are made?
Yeah, I really can't tell you anything about the budget beyond next year.
Sure, yeah. I'm just trying to figure out if we have 2 out of 3 billions accounted for, and I'm wondering, did the third $1 billion, has it already been put into all these other programs you just talked about, or is that mostly still available for future auctions without prejudice about where you're going to get other sources of money or renewing? Can't say. There's just $1 billion mystery money out there. Might be for importing things, might not be. Ben, do you have any sense, since you're not working with insider information so much, how much of this might still be left, or how much of it has probably constructively been put to use on importing stuff or otherwise working on these other different initiatives?
Yeah, I think it's quite complex because political announcements are conflated with this pot of money in the Innovation Fund, and it's not actually clear what the future will be like. I think it's an auction by auction, is my understanding, as one is announced. That's essentially what we know. The Innovation Fund will still be there. That's quite a significant chunk of money, and that will continue to support just clean tech in general, not hydrogen, but other things. And my guess would be there'll be political decisions made over where to channel this money. Should it stay? Because there's another whole part, which is the broader Innovation Fund that does similar things with a different design of disbursement, and separating those, I guess, will be a question. And maybe also back to you, Anna, if on the international side, I wondered, is there any update, or is that still, we're kind of waiting to understand what might happen there? If not meaning to ask any question that's difficult, just if anything's publicly available, I'm not actually sure.
No, that's totally fine. So on the international side, unfortunately, this is not money that can come from the Innovation Fund, because legally we can only spend money on projects within the EU. So the pot where we have money can only be spent on domestic production. And this is what we've started with and what will keep going as well. Now, on the international side, I think we have to wait for budget discussions in the next MFF, which is when new European funds might become available. Or DG Energy colleagues are also working on facilitating member state contributions in case member states want to team up to import hydrogen together at better conditions. I think the most recent tangible announcement from this part of the Hydrogen Bank is the creation of a demand and supply aggregation platform for hydrogen. So there was a press release, I think 1 or 2 weeks ago. This is an initiative, again, that helps to match supply and demand at the moment, actually, to make these projects reach FID. Getting a solid and signed offtake contract is the hardest and most important thing to do. So that platform will help there, but it will also help to collect information on where infrastructure needs are and from where to where we have to bring that hydrogen. So at the moment, that's the work stream that's going ahead with most speed on the other aspects of the Hydrogen Bank.
Super helpful. And I know these probably seem like very sort of 101 level questions in some ways, but it really helps those of us who want to learn about this, because it seems so important, just figure out which numbers go in which pile and how they add up. So I appreciate your bearing with us. We are almost out of time in today's podcast. So do you all have any closing thoughts or things you would like listeners to come away with as they walk into the world with this newfound understanding of what hydrogen could mean?
Partly to congratulate Johanna and the team in the commission for running the auction, which I'm sure is incredibly complex and looks like a great job was done. And particularly, Johanna mentioned it, but making the data available is so helpful for people like myself and others who are interested in the space to better understand. I mean, as we said, not just prices, but also where a company is sourcing this from, and how can we use this data for furthering the discussion on hydrogen in the next years. I mean, the debate on hydrogen has really suffered from proponents and opposition kind of being at loggerheads and really not getting along, having very different visions of the future of hydrogen. So it's quite exciting that we've now had this first auction, that we have much greater transparency on prices, on volumes. And I think all of that, especially with another auction later in the year, can only help as Europeans to have a more informed debate and discussion, and then think, for example, about questions of should there be more budget given into the hydrogen bank versus other needs moving forward. So yeah, only comment would be, yeah, thanks for all the data.
Yeah, thanks a lot. There will be more data, and I think that's also my big takeaway, is that this was really a pilot, and we've shown that it can work. And we've also seen that it's really been appreciated by the market that we have published so much information. I would still say you need to take everything with a pinch of salt, because whilst it's a 130 project, it's by no means the whole market in the EU. It's a snapshot on that. So I think that's also a good reason to keep going and to expand the pool of information that we can reveal here. And I also have to say that project developers, banks, everyone active in this space has been really helpful and really engaged in helping us shape this as something that works, and that works for those who have to bid. So I'm optimistic that we can move towards leaner, less bureaucratic, and quicker subsidy instruments in general. We want to achieve multiple things, and we have to make sure that every euro of public money goes the furthest that it can go. And we hope that this is a blueprint for smart spending, smart public spending.
So helpful. And thank you both so much for coming on the show today. The working title when we first came up with the topic for this week was, Will Green Hydrogen Save Us All? And Ben's immediate answer was, well, no, but it can be really helpful. And let's get into that. So for listeners out there, I hope you come away with more of an understanding of what this sector means and what this product means. And I hope you'll join us next time. You can find Ben's excellent blog on our website, bruegel.org. You can find information about the EU Hydrogen Bank and the auctions on the European Commission websites. And you can always find The Sound of Economics on all your favorite podcast channels. Thanks so much, Johanna Sheila, Ben McWilliams. I'm Rebecca Christie. We'll see you next time.